Hello, everyone. Welcome to yet another episode of JIVINITI, Connecting the Dots, in partnership with JaneUnChained News Network, a show that reveals interconnections across concepts vital to public and planetary health. We promote a whole foods, plant-based living and intersectional vegan consciousness for a healthier, happier planet. We have two very powerful women today with us. Please welcome Kathleen Dameron and Julie Wayne. So let's get right into it. Welcome, Kathleen and Julie. I'm going to pose my first question to Kathleen. Kathleen, you are a co-founder, of so many different initiatives, including online MBA programs, and you're a founder consultant at Katie Conseil. You're based in France. How did you start working in the space of diversity, equity, inclusion, multicultural, multiracial consultancy?
Well, I'll just say that my calling came very early in life. So when I was 8 years old, I was one of the many Black children who were a child of the desegregation. So one day, my middle class, loving African-American parents sent my brother off to school. And on the way, there were adult, normal, Christian, white people throwing stones at us children because we were Black, because of the color of our skins. And I remember one day my third grade teacher said, little Black children don't learn like white children. And I remember I stood up from the height of my 8 years old and I said, that is not true. And I'm going to tell my daddy, who of course was my highest authority. And I also was at the top of my class throughout elementary school and middle school. So I learned from that the spirit which moved me to speak, to stand up, drive, determination, and a little bit of intelligence to achieve and to be at the top. And that was the calling of my life, is this why would white people do that to children? How can they have their eyes so closed, their minds so closed, their hearts so closed? So I have been called to racial literacy, to racial justice. When I was 16, I went to university. When I was 18, I came to live in France. I've worked as a multicultural trainer in French multinational organizations, and I've worked as a multicultural, multiracial leadership trainer in French, European, American. I've worked a little bit in Africa, and I even worked a little bit in India. So from that calling, I have throughout my life so far been involved and concerned by that. Nivi, you're muted.
Thank you so much for sharing that story. And thank you so much for calling out that I was on mute, trying to manage a few things backstage. But Julie, my next question to you is, how did you, just as Kathleen shared with us about her experience as a child, of potentially racism and understanding that there are some disparities that we experience in the world today. How did you, growing up in the U.S., experience your childhood? When did awareness of, certain things dawn upon you? Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, thank you, first of all, Nivi, for inviting me. I'm thrilled to be here with you and Kathleen. It's really, when I heard what you said, Kathleen, it struck me in the heart, because what I lived was something, of course, totally different from you, but I lived it as a child. The first time I really was aware of what white privilege is all about. And it might sound presumptuous, but it really was when I was maybe about 5 years old. And I didn't have the words for it at that time. I didn't know how to express what I experienced. And it's only retrospectively that I've been able to understand what I was actually living, which was the acknowledgement that my whiteness put me in a more advantaged position, and with that, a profound sense of injustice. And I've not shared the story very much, so I'm sort of giving it to you for the first time. Most people have never heard this story, most of my friends haven't. So I was born into a middle-class Jewish family in the United States and raised in Detroit in a middle-class Jewish neighborhood. And as far as I can remember, we always had help, who we called the maid. Now it goes without saying that our maids were always African American. At that time, we called them colored. And I must have been about 5 years old when Yvonne moved into her bedroom in our basement. She stayed with us during the week, and she went back home on the weekends. And she started working for us. I adored Yvonne. She was my everything. She was perfection. And she loved me. She was very, very protective of me. I could do no wrong for her. And I don't have a lot of memories of that part of my childhood, but what I do remember is one moment in my childhood when she took me home with her. We took the bus and she took me home with her. And we stayed there for the day, and she took me from house to house and introduced me to all of her friends and her neighbors, and we had lunch together. And everybody was really, really friendly. It was quite uneventful, actually. And it wasn't until a couple of days later that I began to feel that something wasn't right about that visit. There was something that happened. I couldn't really put my child's mind around it. Something was not right. I didn't understand. And I remember thinking that Yvonne's friends and her family were just as nice and just as friendly as my friends and family. And that the children in Yvonne's neighborhood were just like the children I played with. And I remember also thinking that there was no difference between Yvonne's people and my people. But there had to be something, because why else wouldn't we be living together? And then when I asked the question to Yvonne, she laughed and she said, "Julie, sweetie, we coloreds work for you whites and not the opposite." And I was shocked. I was angered. I mean, I understood it was true because she told me and she would never lie to me. I thought it was just horrible. It was just totally unfair. And I knew there was no difference between us. I didn't want there to be a difference between us. But Yvonne was telling me that society said there was a difference, and that colored people would work for me when I got older, just because they were colored and I was white. And that was my introduction to white privilege, and it was brutal.
Well, yeah, that's a very powerful story, Julie. Your audio and your video was very choppy, so I did offer to post the story in the form of a comment, later, because probably some of our viewers may not have been able to catch it. But it's when you actually hear someone tell you as a child that Julie, sweetie, this is the way of the world. And that's a very powerful and a brutal introduction to the unfortunate reality of systemic racism in which we live at this point. Kathleen, help us, establish some definitions, because as I know that our topic is all about, what's racial literacy got to do with effective leadership. So we're going to talk about racial literacy and effective leadership, but what is racial literacy? How do you define that?
Well, as you can imagine, there are lots of definitions of racial literacy. And at this moment in the United States, it's a huge issue around what is racial literacy. So let's just go back and say that, first of all, racial literacy is the first step towards racial justice, racial healing. We're talking about three things: an analytical understanding of racism as a structural, as an organizational, as an institutional issue, system. We're talking about our emotional intelligence that allows us to be able to resolve conflicts on an interpersonal level and also within organizations. And many people include inside racial literacy the idea of a commitment to action. So effective racial literacy is we have knowledge, analytical knowledge of a system of racism. So it's not about whether you like or don't like Black people. It's about a system and a practice that has been put into place, from housing to education to schooling to implicit bias. It's talking about your emotional intelligence, or we're going to talk about your heart. So your heart is open to the humanity of people who don't look like you. And we're talking about your gut. And in emotional intelligence and in racial literacy, your gut, that's the center where you decide what is right and wrong for you, your values. And so this is all a framework that allows us to build up the capacity for greater racial literacy within individuals and within organizations so that we can create a world that is different than the world that we have.
Thank you for that. And that's a very powerful model. I'm just going to pull it up again on our screen for our viewers to see. It says our three minds. And Kathleen, you shared that analytical, emotional, the gut, really using our vagus nerve and the gut brain heart axis. Those are some of the things. And I know that, in this conversation, you're going to talk, more about this. But before we go there, Julie, my question to you is, as a vegan environmentalist, somebody who's not living in her home country at this point in time, you're also based in France. Both of our panelists today have a French connection. But your journey to being a vegan leader, how did that happen? Like, what was your journey like towards your racial literacy, if I may call that?
Well, I think that that's kind of a long story, but I think that I think that it's putting myself out of my comfort zone, basically. I think that is how I've grown, and I think that's how, as an effective leader, and growing as a leader, we must proceed. We have to get ourselves out of our comfort zone, because our comfort zone is that bubble that we've all created to keep ourselves, or shall I say our egos, safe. And like any safe space, our comfort zone is really important because we've generally chosen the people that we're interacting with, and we understand the signals and the meanings of all of those signals. We know how to respond to the stimuli, and we also have a sense of control over that little micro environment, that bubble. But by growing as a leader, or just by growing as a person, I believe, but also growing as a leader, I think that we have to sometimes relinquish control. We have to relinquish the sense of control that's so important to us in the world. And we have to challenge ourselves by learning different signals and their meanings that we don't yet know, but that we want to learn, whether we're living in a foreign country, for example, but if we're just living in the world and we want to be more inclusive and we want to be more sensitive to other people's experiences and more open to dialogue in a very, very complex world. There's all these little pieces in the world, and if we just keep ourselves in one little piece, we're robbing ourselves of such just all of these other moments of beauty and of learning and of growing as people and becoming much, much more complete human beings.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's such an amazing way to put it. Julie, thank you for that. You've spoken about this bubble, and you mentioned that it's that safe space where people sort of hide and they live with just a selected group of people, just socio-cultural, psychological signaling ecosystem, that they're comfortable with, and they're very afraid, you mentioned, to relinquish control. And when they don't do that, when they're not able to do it, they're not able to avail of all the beautiful moments, that they may be able to enjoy with people who don't exactly look like them or talk like them. So moving on, Kathleen, next question is to you. We speak about, obviously racial literacy, and you've helped explain the definition for that. Julie's brought in this whole idea of how much beauty we're missing, because the beauty is missed on both sides. If one person is not open, if the other person is not open, we miss that beauty on both sides. There's another term I've heard you speak about in our previous interactions, and that's racial healing. So help us understand, what's the difference between these two words, racial literacy and racial healing?
So I'm going to connect in just a moment to what Julie just said, because it's really where you're going to find the need for racial healing. As individuals, we like to think of ourselves as these ego-centered, neocortex-ruled, separated, disconnected individuals with a rational mind that decides all. That is not true. It is far from true. Neocortex does not rule. Rational mind does not decide. We are led by the implicit. We are led by what we have learned. We are led by 500 years of white hierarchy. The white hierarchy, what we call white supremacy, this white racism, internalized in Black and brown bodies, and internalized, embedded in all of our social systems and institutions, in our biases and how we perceive. And yes, white bodies, with their closed eyes, their closed minds, and their clean hearts, they look out and they don't see the beauty, the contributions. And so that blockage is called trauma. And we know a lot about healing trauma these days. And healing trauma is about how can you go back and unfreeze your bodies. How through breathing, how through movement, whether it be stretching or yoga, martial arts. How is it that we can hum, sing, relax our bodies, and connect our bodies back to other people, back to the environment around us? How can we connect to a vision of oneness? Because we are connected to the planet. This white hierarchy over all people, but also white hierarchy over the planet, so no respect for the planet. This is a misconception that is dangerous. And this is a trauma through breathing, movement, humming and singing, vision and resources, that you stop, you slow down. And that gives you a window, an opportunity to actually see the world, to feel the humanity, to feel that you belong to the planet. So a healing-centered approach to release the trauma in white bodies so we can actually walk the path of creating. And when, Julie, when you were talking about this discomfort zone, so the healing racial justice allows people to go through, to hold the discomfort, to hold it so that they can release it, and that they can find themselves able to create something else. If you just have knowledge, and you just showed, if you could show that again, the head, the heart, the gut, they all have to be through the literacy. And then the next step, they need to be healed so that you can put the effective racial literacy into place. And this is fundamental for coming out of that bubble, for creating something more inclusive, for dissolving the discomfort.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much for that, Kathleen. And, as you were speaking, I was thinking about the kinesthetic healing, how some people, and a lot of us as humans, we tend to hold trauma in our bodies, and trauma goes two ways, right? It's also the remnants, the residue of maybe trauma that we were born into, that was inflicted upon us, or the trauma that we either knowingly or unconsciously inflicted upon another. And it sort of stays, and those are some of the lies and ties that end up, binding us in a strange way. Kathleen.
I just wanted to say, yes, we have our individual traumas, but we have intergenerational traumas, and more the
Yes.
trauma that your parents and your grandparents went through, it is within you. And it's also true, we have cultural traumas. When we talk about these 500 years, I mean, just stop for a moment. For 500 years, white males have said that they are the top of humanity. They are the top of creation. And all good things come through them. And if you just think for a moment how traumatic that is for other bodies, but also how much they have to close down. And it also enables them to exploit absolutely everybody and everything that is not them.
Yeah, yeah.
That is a trauma. That is a deep trauma.
Yes, and you know, this is a profound connection. I think that this is something that's very, very important for those of us in the animal rights movement, in the civil rights movement, and social justice, climate justice, you know, women's empowerment movement. Everyone really needs to understand this, that there is a powerarchy at play, unfortunately, that has been all pervasive. It's been rampant through the centuries, and it has created a sense of otherness. You know, and I know, Kathleen, in your work, you also speak about otherness. But I'm going to field my next question to Julie, because, you know, she's Julie, through your journey to becoming an effective vegan leader, you understood, you know, your privilege. You also understood the power of prejudice, as you know, your friend Yvonne shared with you those amazing insights. And you've spoken about this relinquishing of control, right? And Kathleen's spoken about that once that control is relinquished, there is in so many ways you can heal yourself, you can, you know, enable healing for others, and so on. But how does one relinquish control, especially if it comes with privilege? Because you're gaining something from it. You know, what's in it for you know, a privileged person to relinquish control?
Unmute. Well, before I get to that answer, because it's very important, what Kathleen was just talking about, I thought really touched me. And there was a book that I read a long time ago, and I just reread. It's called An Unnatural Order. I think the name of the author is Jim Mason. I hope I got that right. But it really talks about this idea of dominionism. And it talks about the sort of the white European male, the patriarchy that has spread across the world, and how our sense of hierarchy, but our hierarchy not just amongst human beings, but also our cut with non-human animals, misogyny, and especially how we are connected or disconnected with nature. And all natural processes have occurred. And it's absolutely brilliant. And it's so much along the lines of what you were talking about, Kathleen. So please, you know, anyone who's listening, if you haven't read this book, it's very enlightening. To talk about the question of how do you relinquish control when it comes with privilege that you might be born with, it's a really great question. And I think the first step in relinquishing control is to recognize that privilege. And that can be really, really difficult, because when we're actively working, especially for those people who are actively working in social justice movements and putting our efforts toward the systemic change of society so that, among other things, this type of privilege no longer exists and it's something of the past. If we're not aware of that privilege, we can't relinquish control, because unexamined privilege is unconsciously integrated into how we are in society. It's not just how we are perceived or treated by the rest of society, but how we think and act upon our experiences. So once we've accepted and examined how our privilege can affect not just our relationship with others, but theirs with us, it becomes a lot easier to step out of our bubble, because we have less fear of unintentionally making a hurtful mistake, because mistakes will happen. But if they do, we have a lot more confidence to admit it, and to apologize for it, and to ask for help in order to learn from it, because that's ultimately what we want to do, right? We want to learn from our successes, but also our mistakes and our failures. That's what makes us a better human being.
Thank you for that, Julie. It actually, as you were talking, it reminded me of this fantastic book by Dr. Melanie Joy, the vegan matrix, and you mentioned the issue of unexamined privilege. And I just want to quickly quote from her. She says, "Unexamined privilege causes us to be defensive against anything that would help us become aware of the fact that it exists. And the antidote to carnism is awareness, except that carnist or carnistic privilege exists specifically to block that awareness." Wise words there by Dr. Melanie Joy. So thank you so much for mentioning that. The Vegan Matrix, in addition to the book that you mentioned, which shares about dominionism and this dominionistic ideology that perpetuates this whole otherness. That I'm a certain color, therefore everybody else is the other. I'm human, so therefore anything that's non-human, even though it's sentient, is the other, and therefore I'm not going to respect its sentience. Now both of these, both of you, amazing, powerful women have traveled the world, and you have had an opportunity to work with so many different organizations. Kathleen, like me, you worked with so many different multinational organizations, companies wanting to internationalize themselves. Tell us a little bit about your experience in from multicultural to multiracial when it comes to helping these organizations internationalize themselves.
Okay. When we talk about the large multinational organizations, in fact, they're not really multinational. If you take the top 100 people in those organizations, those top 100 people are the same race, the same color, the same nationality, and generally the same social upbringing. So what you find is that most multinational corporations, I can even say very few and recently have worked on it, the top 100 people are all the same. There is no diversity. And that means that they have the assumption that there's no talent or intelligence outside of people who look like me. So as long as you stay in your country, that might work. But as you start working across national borders, it doesn't work. And if you try to include the various racial populations in your own country, it doesn't work. So you have the impact of these assumptions, which is you exclude people except a very narrow set of looking people and acting people. They look the same, they think the same. So you have group thought and you block innovation. And when you want to ask white males to change, they have nothing in their experience about seeing other people, other cultures, other contributions. They need to learn to see it. Julie, you were talking about codes. They need to learn to decode, because the other populations, have learned how to decode. They've learned how to code switch. They've learned how to adapt. And so what you can see between multiracial and multinational is this whole population of high-level managers, high-level leaders who really do not know how to see, how to value, and how to adapt to anything that is different from themselves.
Yeah, and that's an important, awareness, and it's very important for us to understand that leadership is somehow, leadership opportunities, leadership positions, influence coming from those positions, persons that dictate strategy, policy as it filters down to the other, employees in the organization. If it's just coming from one set of rules, which is not even what the employees might have actually had any role to create, then it can start to feel very unfair, very quickly. I've had the opportunity to, work with some truly multinational organizations, and of course, I spent time in consumer marketing, and there was an interesting concept that I was introduced to at a very early stage in my career. It was called consumer license, and I've lived in 7 different parts of the world, and as an Indian, I wouldn't know, living in Russia, how to innovate for Russians and create advertising and communication for them. So this concept came in really handy, and I think that for organizations in the vegan world, plant-based movement, since we're talking about internationalizing, Kathleen, this could be a good example. No one was even allowed to participate in meetings unless they had first understood their communication target audience. And that was achieved by doing research, doing focus groups, understanding what your target audience wanted, such that international teams from different types of nationalities, all across the board, could actually understand who they were going to talk to and create innovation for. Otherwise, I would have had no clue. I was not raised with any mayonnaise. It's not part of South Asian cuisine at all, right? Okay, so Julie, talking about where I was raised, which is India, and you have an amazing history with my corner of the world. What was the difference, that you experienced between being a white-bodied American woman in Europe and a white-bodied American woman in India? Tell us a little bit about that experience.
Well, I think the thing is that I was born in the United States. I was educated in the United States, and when I was finished my college, I went off and I traveled for about 3 years and worked in different places for about 3 years. And then in 1985, I settled in France. So I was in France, and I didn't know the language at first, but I did blend in. Right? There was a very, very big difference. And then about 10 years later, about 25 years ago, I started to travel frequently and actually live at certain moments of time in South India, rural South India. Now, what we have to remember is rural South India, I stick out like a sore thumb. I don't blend in at all. Especially in the ultra South area, people are small, they're small boned. They have dark eyes and dark skin, sometimes very, very dark skin, and they have almost black hair. And here I was 5'8". I had dyed hair at the time, but it was probably like a reddish chestnut color. I have blue eyes, white skin, very white skin, blue eyes, and glasses. And so I just did not. And so it's really interesting because I think that being an outsider, I actually thrive on it personally. I love being an outsider. I love being an outsider because it really gives me an opportunity to have a different perspective, to observe, and also to come down to what is really the common human experience. What are we all here trying to do? And the thing is that when you're an outsider, there's some certain lessons that we have to learn. The first one that I learned is not to pretend that I'm anything other than what I am, meaning an outsider, and to be that someone who has everything to learn and is certainly open to being taught. The second thing is just not to take myself so seriously, to allow myself to make silly mistakes, faux pas. They're never very important, right? I'm not hurting people by doing it, but I'm making a little bit of not a fool of myself, but still, I'm the laughing stock. And I'm able to laugh at myself. And that, I think, is such an important thing that I've learned to do. And I think that it really changes us when we learn to lighten up about ourselves and we allow ourselves a lot more levity, not just about ourselves, but also in with other people.
Yeah, those are some great pointers. So what I understood, number one, be comfortable being an outsider. Number two, do not forget that you will always be an outsider. Number three, obviously we've touched upon that, is humility and being openness, to learning. And number four, it's pretty interesting and a very surprising tool that you mentioned. It's levity or humor. And that's pretty interesting. It reminds me of a book that I'm reading at this point. I'll pull it up on our screen. It's called Humor Seriously, and how humor, when done responsibly, consciously, actually can help leaders move forward. And I'm told it's highly correlated with resilience. So Kathleen, my next question is to you. When we take into account all of this, these things in the toolkit that, vegan leaders and grassroots organizations and vegan organizations, plant-based organizations can choose from, or use all of them in their arsenal, how is then racial literacy related to leadership effectiveness? If you can delve a little deeper into that would really help our viewers.
So you want to know how is it related? So I come back to just what I was mentioning earlier. Who do you want to have in your organization? Who is your market? Do you want to have BIPOC market? Do you want to have BIPOC members? Do you want to be present in BIPOC communities? Do you want to have people who don't look like you, of different races, within your organization? If you say yes to any of those questions, then that means you need racial literacy. I loved it when you were talking about, yes, in your career in the multinational world, as someone who's in communication and marketing, you had to learn the other people. That's racial literacy. You had to learn them. You had to be able to understand them. So if you want to work across cultures, if you want to work outside of just the people who look like you need to be able to observe yourself. You need to be able to observe others. You need to be able to say, what's the gap between how we do things and how they do things? So I analyze, evaluate. I do not think that my way is the only way or the only right way. Very American. And it also means that you know how to decode so that you can go that way. And then you can explain to people how to come towards you. It means that you know how to code switch in certain situations, and it's always situational. It means that you have curiosity. And when it comes to humor, it's not humor you make a joke. It's very much what she said. It's that humor about yourself, that when you are awkward, when you don't know, that you can accept it. It's not their fault. It's, oh, this happened to me. It's part of being here. What have I learned? And those are the people, that racial literacy, those are the people who get others to follow them. Because if you are not followed, you're not a leader. So how are you going to grow your racial literacy enough that you invite, incite, inspire people who are not of your race to want to follow you, and to want to follow you to an objective, to a place that they feel is worth the journey? So that's some of the link between racial literacy and leadership, which is people follow me. And if you are a vegan, plant-based organization and you want others to follow you, well, how much racial literacy do you need that they're going to follow you from their habits into unknown, uncharted territory because you say it's a good idea? Right. That's how much racial literacy you need.
Yeah, and exactly, because racial literacy, like how much of it do I need? And that's a very interesting question. Kathleen, a quick follow-up question to you is, I've heard people say racial literacy is, or racism, for example, is binary, right? Like either you are or you're not. And then if I'm racially literate, now yesterday I might have been racist, but today because I'm racially literate and I attended this workshop, today I'm not racist at all. Like, how does that work? And what is the model that you think about?
I want to laugh because last night I was in a conference talking about racism, and you hear white people say, oh, I don't have a racist bone in my body. Do you know 500 years 500 years of institutional, cultural, white is at the top of all of the other races. And so it's not binary. It's a continuum. You have some white people whose behavior is that I think that all non-white people are inferior to me. And then you can go along the continuum and you say, well, they're not inferior, but da-da-da. And then you can get to the point that say, well, I don't feel comfortable around them. I don't understand them. And then you can keep going until you get to the point where you say, I believe that all human beings are equal and deserve justice, and that we need to give reparation in our society to create now social justice, equity, and dignity. So it's a long way from, I think that all non-whites are inferior to me, moving through what we've talked about, my cognizant analytical mind, my heart mind, moving through the guts and having the values to stand up to when I'm in a party and I hear a microaggression, I have the guts to say something about it, to say it's not fair. I have the guts and the heart to say I relinquish my privilege so that everybody participates in it. This is the path of racial literacy, which also includes racial literacy. So when we talk about someone saying, I'm not racist, I'm like, it's not binary. Where are you at on the continuum? And more importantly, where do you want to go as an individual? And for the organizations that are plant-based, where do you want you to be? Where do you want your organization to be? And that gives you the opportunity to build a roadmap.
Very well said and very well defined. Thank you so much for that, Kathleen. Almost sounds like it is, first of all, an inside job. And an inside job, not just organizationally, but an inside job when it comes to leaders in grassroots organizations, plant-based organizations, vegan organizations who want to create a diversity, equity, inclusion strategy or a policy or even draft a statement around that. And when we say the inside job, it's about culture. It's really about identifying, understanding what your organizational culture is and looking at that continuum that you mentioned. I'll pull it up on the screen again, that it's, first of all, understanding it's not binary, it's a continuum, and evaluating where you might be on the continuum and where is the next step for you, where do you want to go, because it's really not about, it's about progress and it's not about perfection, as the saying goes. Julie, you helped co-found an organization with two other persons, who are of South Asian origin. And, in your travels and in your experiences, even before you had co-founded Jeeva Bhavana in India, what were some of the struggles, any travel experiences, any other experiences that you can share with us that enabled you to sort of commit to the inside job of racial healing and racial literacy? I bet it wasn't comfortable at first, so we'd love to know more about your experiences.
Well, it wasn't comfortable and it wasn't linear. Let's put it that way. These things are not like, you're here and then you're there and you're there and you're there, at least not for me. It's sort of facing things, seeing things, lacking responses, wanting to have responses, taking a step back and everything like that. One of the things I think for me that was the most important was, I think there's two things. One is that is accepting the limits of my cross-cultural literacy. Because it's really, really easy, especially when you've immersed yourself in another culture and you like that culture, you love that culture, you're fascinated by that culture. It's really, really easy to think that you're more literate than you actually are. So I've made that mistake. I've made that mistake on a number of occasions. And I've even made a mistake when friends of that culture have said to me, oh no, don't do that. That's not a good idea. And I did it anyway. For some reason, I guess I wanted to prove, I had something to prove that I was actually more literate than they thought I was. But actually what they ended up proving was just the opposite. So one of the things I guess we can take out of that is that if we're lucky enough to know somebody in this, culture, or of this race that we are attracted to or interested in, or that we're spending our time working with. We want to know more of. Is that if you're lucky enough to know somebody in that person, take that in that culture, take that person's advice on matters that have to do with what their race is and their culture, because no one will ever know more about it or better than these people itself, than the people that you're friendly with and things like that. So I think that also what's interesting with cross-cultural literacy and accepting the limits of our cross-cultural literacy is that actually it can make us more literate once we've accepted that we have our limits, right? I have a lot of examples, and I don't want to really go into them because we don't have so much time. I could go on forever, of course, and I'm sure Kathleen could, and I'd be fascinated. But I've been in situations, for example, where Europeans in Tamil Nadu, for example, where I happen to spend a lot of time, where they were absolutely not culturally literate. As a matter of fact, they almost took pride in how little they knew about the culture. But they were there. They had a boutique hotel. And they were there because they wanted to enjoy the fruits of this merchant class that was in the heart of Tamil Nadu and had these palaces. And so they, as architects, they made this wonderful boutique hotel. So they were in smack dab in the middle of a culture that they had absolutely no interest in, other than the fact that they were able to have people come in who were interested, clients. And so something happened in that hotel. And all of a sudden, their staff members were not working at all. They were not coming in, or they were leaving late. There was a very bad ambiance. And they asked me if I could actually intervene because I spoke a bit of Tamil at this point, and I was very interested. I mean, rural Tamil Nadu is basically my expertise. It has become my expertise. So I went and I talked to these people, and they told me that a worker who had worked on the renovation of this hotel and who was not hired afterwards to work in the hotel, he basically came the week before and he did black magic, and he said to all of these people, you are going to get hurt, you're going to die, you're going to lose your job. So, and so the ambiance was horrible. They didn't want to work. They didn't know what to do. They wanted to work and everything like that. And I talked to them, and the thing is what I realized, because, I've worked in that area for such a long time, is that this is real for them. It's real. This idea that they were going to struggle and they might die was very real to them. But I also realized, because I was literate enough to understand that, but not literate enough to help to do anything about it. And so that allowed me to take the next step, which was to go out to a village where I happened to know a pujari, a priest who was extremely venerated because he read the future and things like that, and he just had this great following. And to actually bring one of the workers to him so that the worker could tell him his story. And then the next day I brought the pujari to the hotel itself. And the pujari did a big puja, ritual in order to basically drive away the evil eye and then bless the people. And what was really interesting about that is that from one moment to another, the ambiance just changed. They became bright and cheerful, and it was a really, really beautiful, transition. It was very, very sudden, but it really worked, basically, because I was able to understand that that's what was needed, And what was really great about it, and very touching, very poignant about it for me, was that the next day, all of the staff members were coming to me and asking me to come to their homes to meet their families, because they recognized that I knew enough about their culture and was interested about the culture to actually make that next step. And that, to me, I think, is also enhancing one's literacy. It's admitting our barriers and our limits and where we can go and where we can't go.
Yeah, Julie, that's a brilliant story. That's a brilliant example of, how I used your present level of cultural literacy, and use that to forge a solution that wasn't just from your social background, your ethnic background. It's really not about copying, pasting Western templates and saying, painting everything with a brushstroke and say, this worked for us, therefore that's also going to work for you. But you actually, allowed for what was theirs, and for that the solution that was culturally appropriate for that situation. In activism, so a lot of times people bring their own stories, right? They bring their own stories and their wounds and their ancestry, and they believe that because I've gone through something similar, I'm able to empathize with others, and a lot of times that empathy, is genuinely something that powers their work. Kathleen, my next question to you is, we know from data, 79% of the animal rights movement, vegan movement, plant-based movement in the US, they're women, they're mostly white, some of them with mixed ancestry as well. How can they tap into the full power of their divine feminine and bridge this gap of systemic racism and bring within their fold, or invite within their fold, sisters from BIPOC communities? And also a slightly different question, which I'm just looking at some comments. We have Dr. Stacey Anderson, and she says, I'm both Native and white. My hair is red and my eyes are blue. And she says, how shall I speak about any of this? Because, she says, I'm a mutt of the encroachment of Europeans on this continent. So, and she's an animal rights activist, she's a very powerful vegan advocate. How can women like Stacey and others bring their divine feminine and also their understanding of their ancestry, the trauma and the wound, and empower their work? Kathleen.
That is a very complex question. I'm going to go back and put in something a little first step. So we've talked about racial literacy. We've talked about racial healing. Those are first steps. No matter where you are, these women need to know what racial literacy do they have for non-white women, for women of color? To know what we've done, what we've brought, what we've contributed to society. Are their hearts open to our experience? So I would say, let's look at their racial literacy. Let's look at their racial healing. And for a lot of European-based white women, a lot of that racial healing is to go back and connect and reclaim the fact that Europeans killed white goddesses. If you were accused of being a witch, you died. They would tie you up, throw you in the water, and if you didn't come up, you were not a witch, but you were dead. And if you came up, they'd kill you. So just to be accused. So the divine feminine in this European white world has been crushed, and they've tried to eliminate it. So it's really good to go back and recognize, to study, to get your racial literacy up on where it comes from women of color. And then you need to do your racial healing for how it was destroyed in your culture and for how they have squashed and recognized it in non-white cultures, because there's a game there of, oh yes, the Africans have it, yes, the Native Americans have it, but then you squash it at the same time. So that's a longer answer. And then there's another step, which is, how are you going to go towards these other cultures with internship, inviting them to come and be interns in your organization, but not one, because if you invite one, you do not have critical mass to have safety. So how am I going to find a group of them to invite in to our organization? And then the next step is stewardship. How am I going to have them counsel, coach me? You put this up, please go back to that. This man is about to become, well, probably become mayor of New York. And this is a Black man who's a former policeman and who has written a book about this plant-based healing, this healthy. So if you want to go towards the Black community, have you got him to advise you, to counsel you, to coach you? That's the stewardship. Have you followed him and what he's trying to do? Have you relinquished? I love this word, Julie. Have you relinquished and said, I will follow him for part of the road? And what did he want to do? And how does he say it? And what are his recipes? And learn from him and follow him before you try leadership, and leadership on a goal, an objective, a mission that is shared between a BIPOC community, between women of color, and between women who are white. So I'm going to do that again. First, you need to get your racial literacy. Then you need to do your racial healing. And then you're going to start on that. Yeah, very much. It's not binary. So you're coming along a path. And then as an organization, the organization brings in interns, a group of people. So, because if you bring in one, they're going to get squashed. So bring in the interns, do the stewardship, get his book, learn from it, bring in people to advise, to counsel, to coach you. It's what Julie said. She went to the village. She had someone who knew, be responsible, be a steward. They stewarded her, coached, advised. And then do followership. I follow the women of color. And then, and only then, do I try and do something that's leadership with them. Okay, that's a roadmap.
Yeah, that's a very powerful roadmap and something that cannot be accomplished overnight. These things take time. They need patience. They need us, because everything is a level up. You need to have necessarily accomplished the level before to be able to tap into your power. So racial healing before racial literacy, and racial literacy before you're able to do the internship, the stewardship, the followership, and so on that Kathleen mentioned. That's such a fantastic model. We're learning so much from you, Kathleen. You want to say something?
I want to add something. Julie talked about acceptance. Your racial literacy, your racial healing, you accept. It will never be complete. Except that I have learned that I know and I'm on a path. So your word of acceptance, I'd like to put into that model. I'm on a path and I accept that I'm going up the ladder, and sometimes I'll go back down the ladder. Acceptance.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. So absolutely. When we have anger, when we have indignance, when we feel a certain way about what the wrongs that we might be carrying because of that intergenerational trauma, one of the key words is acceptance and being at peace with our own selves, if it's possible, to the extent that it might be possible, because it might vary from individual to individual. We are running out of time. We have literally 2 minutes left, but I want to give the mic to Julie, because Julie is walking and talking racial healing, racial literacy, and she's been on this path for so long. Julie, tell us about Jeeva Bhavana's Urva Rasa initiative, where you're putting all of these models that you have in your head to work with farmers in India. You're on mute, Julie. So if you would unmute yourself, please.
There we go. So, first of all, I just had this incredible opportunity to have founded and direct an NGO called Jeeva Bhavana with two partners, Madhavi Kolte and Sanjeev Naik. And we're a vegan environmental NGO, so we're really studying animal agriculture, the absolute horrors of animal agriculture, and everything that's related to animal agriculture environmentally, but also the skyrocketing chronic diseases and hunger and just the economic ruin of so many farmers because of vested private interest that trumps public good. So just yesterday, we launched our Farmers Empowerment Program, and it's called Urva Rasa. And it empowers farmers and consumers by promoting and guaranteeing fair trade, sustainably grown, cruelty-free, healthy, plant-based foods. Now, what we're doing is we're creating direct farmer-consumer channels, and we're working with the farmers in order to provide them with a decent livelihood, getting them out of breeding and exploiting animals, growing food forests as perennial food sources, and we're creating this consumer channel so that the farmers and the consumers are able to work together to create a much better India for the planet, for themselves, for the animals, for our health.
That is fantastic. Julie, congratulations to you, to Madhavi, and to Sanjeev. I follow you guys very closely. You're part of our Divinity Coalition, and thank you so much for continuing to show up for that coalition. Even though, we've experienced that a lot of people, when they hear this is a BIPOC coalition, it's only meant for BIPOC women leaders, blah, blah, blah. And we don't see a lot of other, white Caucasian leaders show up for us. But thank you so much. You've done that, and for your grace and your participation, and congratulations for VIRSA. With that, dear viewers, I thank Kathleen and Julie for sharing your wisdom today with us. I also want to quickly thank our broadcast partners, without whose partnership this wouldn't be possible. Of course, JaneUnChained News Network, the VIRSA Foundation, Main Street Vegan, Plant-Based Nutrition Movement, Seeds to Inspire Foundation, Plant Pure Communities, and all the wonderful pod leaders who made the time, invested the time to watch this broadcast today. Jeeva Bhavana, which is Julie's vegan environmentalist NGO, and Thrive Plant Life LLC. With that, we will be back next month with yet another amazing episode for you. This is your host, Nivi Jaswal, signing off. Thank you so much.